Now, one common source of confusion I want to clarify here is the difference between generics and union types. Why could you confuse these two? Well, for example, our data storage here. If we're accepting generic types based on these types, we could also rewrite that to just say, well, we want to store strings or numbers or booleans in here, right? So we could store that, or to be precise, wrap this in parentheses so that we say either of these types as an array. And then here, of course, we could also say, well, what we get here when we add an item is either a string, a number, or a boolean. When we remove it, it's the same. Now, what's the problem with this approach? On first sight, it might look like it achieves the same, but actually does something totally different. What we're saying here is we're storing any kind of data in there as long as it's either an array of strings, numbers, or booleans. And we're also then adding any kind of data here, either a string, a number, or a boolean, and the same for removing. Now we already got some errors down there, of course, because I can't initialize this in a generic way anymore, but other than that, it works. Now the problem, however, is for one up here, we're not saying this is either an array of strings or an array of numbers or an array of booleans. This says, well, we got an array which can have strings, numbers, and booleans mixed. So if we would want to say either an array of strings or an array of numbers, we would have to say string array, number array, or boolean array. Well, we can do that, but now we get a problem here. Now we're adding a string, a number, or a boolean, but depending on what we actually set this data array to be, either a number array or a boolean array or a string array, we're not allowed to add a number or a boolean or a string. If we set this to be a string array, well, then we can't add a number here. Yet here I am fine with any parameter as long as it is a number, boolean, or string. So the problem is here with union types, we accept any of these values every time this method gets called, or this method. So we're not saying, hey, whenever we're working with this class, you have to decide for one type and then stick to it. Instead, we're saying whenever you're calling this method, you're free to use any of these types. And that's exactly not what we want here. If I revert this to the previous setup where we used generic types, then we got a different setup. Here we say you gotta choose once which kind of data you want to store, and then you're only allowed to add that exact type of data. So here if I add a number, for example, I get an error because that's not a string, and I chose that I only want to manage strings here when I set the generic type. And that's the difference between union types and generic types. Union types can be great if you want to have a function which you can call with one of these types every time you call it. Generic types are great if you want to lock in a certain type. Use the same type throughout the entire class instance you create. Use the same type throughout the entire function. That's where you want a generic type. You want union types when you are flexible to have a different type with every method call, with every function call. Then you can use union types. Generic types lock in a type.